great pleasure to introduce to you today Professor David Byrne. He's an Emeritus Professor of the Sociology Department of Durham University. He's had a long and distinguished career, having published many books on inequality, complexity. There's a long list that we could go through, and he's worked on inequality and taxation and various other sort of aspects related to sociology. He's considered, I suppose, one of the great thinkers when it comes to complexity in the social sciences with us today. So we're very fortunate to have him. His talk today is going to touch on two very, very prescient issues that we're dealing with today, one being the climate and other being COVID. I'm sure all of us have followed the news of what's been going on in the US. As, another hurricane has struck the east coast of the US. Having lived in New York City for about a decade, I was following the news and just seeing all of the storm water draining into the subways. I think it must be harder and harder to deny the realities of climate change for a lot of people who are at the coalface of this. And then, of course, the other issue that we're still grappling with is the COVID pandemic. So David's talk today is really going to look at the intersection between these two and what's coming next. And I'm really interested to hear what he has to say. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, David. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. Okay, can you put up the first slide, please?
While we wait for that, just a reminder that if you have any questions that pop into your head, you're welcome to type those into the chat box. And once David has completed his talk, we'll open up the floor for questions.
This first slide is simply a title, okay? It's the title of a book I've just published called Inequality in the Context of Climate Crisis and After COVID. And I started writing this book with the title Inequality in the Context of Climate Crisis, and then got stuck with the COVID lockdown, okay? And as somebody in his mid-70s, although healthy, but my partner has pre-existing conditions, we were really pretty isolated. So I wrote the book through COVID. And I had to think very much about how that influences the possibilities for change. The book was written because I'm very determined that complexity, or the complexity frame of reference, should not simply be an abstract intellectual position or even just a position informing our social science methodology. It should have to do with the real issues that we face as a human race on this planet. And I started off writing about tax in that vein, and then wrote about class. But then I was very much influenced by thinking about the Capitalocene. Let's go on to the next slide, which is a quote from the Black Americans working class woman author, science fiction author, Octavia Butler. So can we go on to the next slide? I'm just going to let you read that yourself. That was written in 1998. Now, I think it's very prefigurative, right? Butler herself was actually born in 1952. She would have been pretty much the same age as me if she was still alive. But this, I think, is a very accurate description of what has happened in high-income countries and also high middle-income countries. And I focused on those two categories because they contain just over half the world's population. High middle income countries, much larger proportion than high income countries. Most of the high middle income country population being in China, which I think is an extraordinarily important society to examine and think about. South Africa is a high middle income country, but it's an unusual one because it is the most unequal of high middle income countries and has many, many particular characteristics. But this, I think, Octavia Butler, talking about the pox as an apocalypse, I think she was saying something accurate. Her science fiction, The Parable of the Sower, is very, very negative in terms of the implications, although there's hope emerges at the end of the books. But I'm going to refer a bit to near future science fiction, which in some ways has a more optimistic take on it. But if you don't know Octavia Butler's books, I strongly recommend them. Okay, next slide, please. So, my position and method. First of all, it's complexity framed. I think something which anybody who's encountered the complexity frame of reference is perfectly familiar with. Interwoven. I like to use the word interwoven rather than intersecting, because I think it implies a much more elaborate and a really elaborate way in which systems connect to each other. And the causal powers run in all directions. So that's the ontology. All this is dynamic. Systems change their states, but do so in terms of radical reconfiguration, change of kind, phase shifts. Crisis. I was long familiar because I was really, in many respects, I'm a Marxist, soft Marxist, but Marxist, with the idea of crisis. But I'm particularly influenced by Jim O'Connor, who wrote about crisis in a most interesting way. And actually, I think there's an article by him in the 1980s in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. He also wrote a book called Theories of Crisis, but the article summarizes his position. For those of you who don't know Jim O'Connor's stuff, he was very well known for writing a book on the fiscal crisis of the state, but then also developed a very radical social ecological position over a long period of time, socialist ecological. So crises are periods in the trajectory of a system which can't continue for a long time. The term originally comes from the course of an infectious disease. It's over 2,500 years old. It's a Greek word. It's that period, used to be very common in old films, where the doctor would come in and say, the crisis will be tonight. Basically, pre-antibiotic and maybe post-antibiotic, according to my friend Mike Wilson, who's a professor of clinical microbiology, when in an infection, either the immune system overcomes the disease and the patient lives, or the disease overcomes the immune system, the patient dies. The crisis cannot continue. It has to result in change. And we're experiencing on a global scale interwoven crises of the social and the natural. This term capitalocene. I'd just be interested how many people have actually heard that expression. Yeah? But think about it. Right, next slide, please. This is just some references to the idea of capitalocene. It's based, of course, on the idea of the Anthropocene, that human actions are having an enormous effect on the natural world, primarily, of course, in relation to the climate crisis through the use of fossil carbon as the major source of energy in our sort of society. And I'm speaking with somebody, by the way, who is the first in 4 generations since my family fled the famine in Ireland, not to have worked down the County Durham pit as a coal miner, right? So the Capitalocene is an account developed by people who are associated with world systems theory, who say, look, it's particularly the form of capital's relationship with our use of energy and the way in which energy is used, and the pursuit of growth as a logic of capitalism, which has created the situation in which we are. So we're in the era, I say, of the Capitalocene. I've discovered there's almost as much dispute among socialist ecologists as there was historically among Trotskyists, but I think that the core idea which all of them actually have is the idea of the Capitalocene. So if we go on to the next slide, please. One key idea is the idea of possibility space in complexity. And I think it's a really good idea because it says that there is a range of future possible conditions for the development forward of a complex system. It's not infinite. Traditionally, this is an idea which is defined in mathematical terms, and I think it's useful to use the mathematical language of it. Originally, I think it's Poincaré. And interestingly, Poincaré was somebody who was very interested in writing popular science books. He wrote a very good one in the early 20th century, which I recommend people to read. But I'm tying that in with the path dependency, the social scientific assertion that the future of a social, and by implication the interaction of the social and natural systems, is limited by the historical development of that system. There's an Irish joke about somebody lost in the Irish countryside asking a local how to get to the place they want to find. And the local says, if you want to get there, I wouldn't start from here, right? I think that conveys in a way, jokey way, the idea of path dependency. So we're in a path dependent context where our history determines what our future possibilities are. There are multiple but not infinite limited possibilities for the future development and social system we have now. Okay, next slide, please. This is one of the things which Jill Callaghan, who was formerly my PhD student, but a long time ago, and who actually introduced me to some important ideas in complexity, and I have found very useful in the work we've done. It's what we call complexity congruent thinking, where we find ideas which resonate with the ideas of the complexity frame in work done much earlier, going all the way back actually to the middle of the 19th century. And this is Raymond Williams, the Marxist cultural theorist, writing, who was very, very interested in language and what words meant and how they worked. And he was working on the idea of determine in relation to the Marxist proposition that base determines superstructure. And he says determine can mean exact causation, but it can also mean setting limits. And it strikes me, and this, I've used this quotation from him a lot, that that is something like the idea of possibility space, right? It's just something which resonates so carefully with it, okay? And this is a quotation from Gillen in my book on complexity theory, the state of the art. We're writing a second edition of this now. Okay? So there are multiple possible states for the future, but these are limited on the causal situation as it stands now, including in particular the causal potential of human actions. Okay, next slide, please. So futures, right? I don't know if people have read Hayek's Nobel Prize acceptance speech, which is a complexity informed, explicitly informed speech. But Hayek and the Mount Pelerin Society, the malignant organization created in the 1950s to have an enormous impact on the teaching of economics in especially Anglo-Saxon societies, but globally, their idea of complexity asserts that futures are unknowable, the socials generated only by micro-emergent actions of multiple actors in markets, and planning for a desired future is bad. This, I'm going to say bluntly, is ideological nonsense and dangerous ideological nonsense. So I think if we start from a careful post-disciplinary consideration of where we are, and we can imagine possible futures, and think about what actions might produce different futures, then that's what we have to do. And that, of course, is what is happening very much with actions confronting global warming, although they are relying to a very considerable degree on giving market signals to private capitalist organizations. And I think that's not enough, although I'm not proposing a wholly post-capitalist future. So we can do this through a careful synthesis of what we know. And one of the things that helps us in this is good near future science fiction. And I use near future science fiction in the book. Okay, next slide, please. So this is what I did. I think it's useful to talk about, when you've written a book, it's useful to talk about how you did it. I'm a very quick reader. My mother, who was at that time training as a primary school teacher, taught me to read at the age of 3, which has been an enormous advantage to me my entire life. So I read a lot of books, articles, reports, looked at lots of time series of data with a focus on selected cases from high and high middle income countries. China, Brazil, the USA, the UK, but with illustrations from others. I paid a little bit of attention to South Africa, nothing like enough, I think. I looked at the trajectories of inequality, primarily economic inequality, in those countries in relation to those systems and systems of governance. Now, the trajectories are very different. In South Africa, it's plain that there's been a reduction in inequality, which follows on the collapse of the apartheid system. In most other countries, in the high income countries, there's been a massive increase in relative inequality, with a particular impact not only on the poorest groups in society, but in the last 30 years, also on the extremely important middle income groups in that society. And the OECD has produced a report on that, talking about the squeezed middle. There are varying trajectories elsewhere. China has become more unequal, but also relatively, absolutely so much better off. And China, which is such an enormous part of the world's population, is also affected very much by its very strange demography in consequence of the one-child policy. Also, the rural-urban relations in China are enormously different. If urban China was categorized as a single country, it would be a high-income country now. Brazil's interesting, and I think Brazil is the society that South Africans could look at with considerable interest, where the Workers' Party moved things in a much towards equality, and there's been a reaction since the election of Bolsonaro. One thing that's very important is grey literature. Look at the reports produced by governments, by international organizations, not just at the academic literature. There's an enormous amount of very valuable work there. My quantitative work was trending. I just really used time series descriptions. Qualitative work was looking at the qualitative content. And it's all about interpretation of the information, promiscuously and deliberately so. And I found near future science fiction, I've been a science fiction reader since my teenage years, gave me working examples of possible system futures, scenarios. And one thing I'm going to emphasize, I wrote an article about this. Actually, it was a paper I presented in South Africa at the International Sociological Association conference in Durham, about the idea that in the expression cause and effect, we should think of effects as being the character of systems, rather than simple outcomes in relation to a single variable. So next slide, please. So here is just a list of good scenario near future science fiction. The slides will be available and you can look at that later. But it's Octavia Butler, Dr. O. I didn't use Octavia Butler in the book. Kim thought about her later on, and Kim Stanley Robinson particularly. Okay, so that's just a list of books for you. Next slide, please. The themes, Butler, she's apocalyptic. Social collapse, move towards community-based reconstruction, an emphasis on dispossessed minorities, possible move forward. Kim Stanley Robinson is really interesting because he's a science fiction writer who sets it in the very near future and engages very much with the real science, the scientific civil servants of governments. He's a member of Democratic Socialists in America. He's definitely a socialist. His book set about 120 years from now is about post-warming community confrontation with real estate capitalism. And Anton will like this, set in New York, right? So it's very, very interesting. Dr. O is very much somebody who's interested in surveillance capitalism, and his books are about that. But he also picks up the idea of post-work production, the idea that computer production, big theme in science fiction, will actually remove the necessity for work, something which develops the ideas of the way in which we can make things. And there's an idea of communist party. The Communist Party is where people have taken over a factory, which has been abandoned by capital, and they're just making things for people to take away. Okay, next slide, please. And that's it. How long did that take? I took 18 minutes. So you'll allow me maybe about 5 minutes to expand a little bit. Inequality is an absolute global problem. One of the books I used, and I'll have to look it out and give you the reference, was by a professor of war studies writing about climate crisis. And he asserts absolutely accurately that if you look at global power politics, climate crisis is a bigger issue for any global power than its conflicts with other global powers. And actually, I've seen some recent stuff on China where it's being pointed out that China, where the Chinese Communist Party does definitely recognize what's there in relation both to climate crisis and to increasing inequality within China. Although China is actually not the most unequal of countries at all. It has an enormous number of very, very rich people, but it's also created a very large middle class, an upper middle class. And actually, I was teaching the children of this upper middle class for the last 5 years of my career. But the Chinese army, armed forces, are so tied up with confronting climate crisis induced events within their own society that in some ways they, despite their moves in the South China Sea and stuff like that, they're not really an aggressive counter-political power. And we're beginning to see the same sort of thing in the United States, where Biden is probably going to have to use his military as much to deal with the consequences of climate crisis. And he's recognized explicitly that recent events in the USA are to do with climate crisis, as he is with global power. But also the kinds of sacrifices which will be required in high income countries will only be possible if there's a move to reverse inequality. Inequalities which have been produced partly, as Piketty argues, at 1,000 pages. And if anybody's read Weber's Class Status and Party, they'll see that Weber says the same thing in a single paragraph, because of the tendency of wealth to accrue to the owners of capital. But also because of political reactions, particularly against trade unions and shifts in taxation systems. So what do you need to pay attention to? You need to pay enormous attention to taxation. Taxation is extremely important in framing how inequality is constructed. For those people who've ever been involved with social policy, I would refer you back to Richard Titmus's extraordinarily important essay on the social division of welfare, and in particular address the issue of fiscal welfare and the way in which tax remissions favor high income people. Actually, if you look at tax remissions, as a part of public expenditure, there's no difference between the United States and supposedly much more egalitarian Europe, which is because they give tax remissions to particularly to high middle income and high income people. Also look at your benefit systems. I spent a couple of hours yesterday looking at South Africa's taxation system, and I realized that a very high proportion of your taxes are yielded by indirect taxes, which are aggressive in terms of their impact, inevitably. So what's going to happen? We saw with COVID that governments respond to crisis in the way they respond to wars. They respond to crises by spending money, by changing systems, by taking on controls. COVID was an immediate crisis. It was only a crisis because COVID isn't that serious a disease. It's nothing like as serious as the Spanish flu of 100 years ago, or even as the Russian flu of the late 19th century. But we've reached a situation, particularly in high income, but also in many high middle income countries, where states have taken on the responsibility of delivering curative healthcare. And healthcare systems are an enormously important part of the entire system. I don't know if people have ever read the McKinsey Institute's publications. If you haven't, I strongly recommend you do so. McKinsey is the enormous US located, basically business advice system. It's the high priest of capitalism, but also the people who work for it are very clever. And it's always a good idea to look at what people who are the cleverest capitalists are thinking about doing. And McKinsey spent an enormous amount of time pointing out that healthcare is one of the major economic activities of the kind of world in which we live, and that you need to pay particular attention to it, and it offers enormous opportunities for capital to accumulate. In the UK, we're seeing an assault on our previously socialized healthcare system by private capital. But its health is extraordinarily important because there's these claims of aging populations, China not least, by the way, that somehow states have to intervene to stop people dying. If COVID had come along 100 years ago, it would have simply knocked a lot of old people off their perches, me included probably, yeah? And that would have been seen as completely ordinary. It wouldn't have been as severe as the Spanish flu, which affected young people. There would not have been the enormous investment because states take on the responsibility for keeping you healthy. And to some extent, particularly in the United States, healthcare systems have almost taken on the responsibility of keeping you alive forever if you're rich enough to pay for it. Of course, they can't succeed in doing it. So while death is still inevitable, I would point out that taxes are not. And therefore, taxes become an enormously important part of what we have to do in looking at how we manage complex systems. Jim O'Connor, in the fiscal crisis of the state, taxes are a fundamental class issue, but also in a lot of other societies, they're a fundamental, I think South Africa, fundamental ethnic issue as well. Anyhow, that's what I've got to say, what I tried to say in the book, and let's open up discussion.
Thank you very much, David. I've certainly got some questions in the bag, but I'm going to open it up for some others to field questions. You can either just raise your hand or if you want to type anything in the comments. Bruce.
Hi there. Thanks so much for that overview, and I'm looking forward to the book when it comes out. So I'm speaking from the US. I'm in Florida, and what strikes me, and I would agree with your analysis, but what strikes me is that there's also a rhetorical or symbolic level happening that's extremely strong where I am, such that something like the COVID pandemic can, the rhetoric can be obfuscated so that there's not a very clear, people get very confused about causes and effects, about who is really, there to help them and who isn't, and that symbolic level, I think, can be extended to a lot of the other things that you talked about as well. So, taxation can represent something very different for some people. It can represent a force for equality or a force for inequality, and people start believing this at a symbolic level. And so I'm wondering how you work that sort of thing into this analysis, because I just see the force of it in the where I am now. I mean, denying women's healthcare rights has just happened in the US here in Texas, through the essential abolition of the right to abortions. And, this is being presented as looking out for life, when in fact it's exactly the opposite. And so how's the symbolic level work for you?
I think that's a really important point, Bruce, right? I think it's about how we develop discourses of difference, okay? Now, that in some ways is why I think tax is a key one to focus on. I'm trying to remember the name of the organization. I referenced it in the book, but there's a very good think tank, a left-leaning think tank in Washington, which produces enormously valuable information on tax, right? And one of the key issues that exists, and it exists across most high-income countries, is that now labor incomes pay far higher taxes than the incomes that derive from wealth. Yeah, not least because of the impact of fiscal welfare, of the fiscal welfare state and the way that operates, but also in other directions. And we used to talk about earned and unearned incomes. And I really want to reintroduce that distinction into our vocabulary, right? And that's the kind of thing I think you're talking about, right? A culture war, which is about that kind of cultural distinction. It's not that I disagree with other cultural wars, least of all the gender issues, which I think are enormously important and significant, right? And to varying degrees. I mean, there's far more attention in the UK at the minute to trans rights, yeah, than there is, because of an enormous a conflict actually between women, many of whom were radical feminists, right? And certain assertions about trans rights, which, while not insignificant, are really pretty small scale in terms of whatever they're working out at, than there is about real inequalities. Yeah. And it's of course, one of the factors is you're lucky in the States, you're unlucky in Texas, but you're bloody lucky in a lot of the rest of the states because of Democratic Socialists of America, right? And the left wing and the Democrats and OOC and people like that, who it does seem to me are making these issues part of the public discourse. Right? The problem we have in the UK is that this will get me expelled, but I'm desperately trying to get expelled from the UK Labour Party as well. Somebody's listening and will report me. That the Labour Party is taken over by supporters of Zionism, right? And it's expelling socialists on a major basis. Yeah. So it isn't talking about those issues. It's not talking about inequality. But what's particularly interesting is this idea of the squeezed middle. Because in high income countries and in a lot of high middle income countries as well, people who've reached, like me, right? I mean, it's not, you know, I'm grandchild of coal miners, but coal miners are very highly paid workers anyhow, you know, top dollar. Yeah? But who've reached high levels of comfort and security see it as very difficult to transmit that level of comfort and security to their own children. Yeah. And middle income groups are a very, very important political group. So it's about making these issues part of that discourse. Yeah. And I think one of the things I'm trying to do constantly is it's difficult because in a way you're better placed in the States, I think. It's odd because you were so far behind, right? In some ways, right? That you could only come up, okay? But the discourses, the old discourses of the left are not being deployed in Europe. There are moves in that direction, but they're not that strong. Yeah. There used to be a whole series of, there was a left intelligentsia, which was a significant part of the socialist movement, and even the, you know, I mean, for example, for much of a prime minister in my lifetime, for whom I had a great deal of time, was Harold Macmillan, who was a conservative, but actually was a one-nation conservative who thought about these kinds of issues and talked about them in bigger kinds of ways. But the effects are happening. There's a quotation from Edward Thompson that I use a lot, where he talks about experience one and experience two. Experience two is everything you've been talking about, and it's extremely important. It's all the culture, all the discourses. And experience one is hard economic reality. And Thompson says it walks in the door without knocking, right? Yeah. And I just love that expression, you know, because that's what's happening.
Thanks.
It reminds me, talking about the symbolic, Bruce, about the Americans who rebranded estate taxes to death taxes, and just the massive mind shift that happened when that successful lobby effort worked, and people started talking about, oh, you're getting taxed after death. That's horrible. Let's do away with this. And just the spin around it and taxation in the US has always fascinated me. Jean, do you have a question? Just unmute yourself, Jean.
Yes, sorry, I thought I had. Hi, David. Good to see you. As the grandchild of miners too, it's I have lots of sympathy with some of your views around the Labour Party, just as an aside. But I think one point you make really well. I had kind of one agreement and one. How would you see it slightly differently? Is the kind of inevitability of collapse, which is even a stronger word than crisis. So I love the way you just put that about experience one, experience two. There's a way in which, however we kind of mangle the discourse and move it away from something closer to perhaps what is happening, there is an inevitability if we can continue the way we are in terms of inequality, climate change, and kind of, you know, basic human greed that's going on, that things will collapse. And I think it's viewing collapse as a good thing, as something that will allow other possibilities to arise. And so I think that's really interesting. And I feel in some ways that this kind of, a bit like the fall of the Roman Empire and Jared Diamond's book about collapse, you know, people get sufficiently greedy and set in their ways and locked in to power structures that they do eventually fail. So I think that's a positive. The thing I wanted just, and it's a nuance really to just kind of think about, because I completely agree with the idea that there are a finite number of possible future states, the sort of non-ergodicity that Kaufman talks about really well. But there's also something about the interplay with the micro and those possible future states that sometimes means that things happen that we really haven't thought of. So there's a kind of both and about that is really fruitful to look at and interrogate. It's something I say to people: read as widely as you can, and look for signs of people thinking about impending change, or look for so if the economists had looked at the information about pandemics, they might have noticed that the biggest thing that's happened to the global economy was on its way. It wasn't a kind of surprise. It was just not perceived. But there's nevertheless something, I think, that despite the possible future states and all the really valuable focus that we should have on thinking about those, that sometimes something happens that we haven't imagined, that the micro interacts with these trends. The patterning of the trends is kind of invaded by the micro and creates a future that we haven't considered. So I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely right, Jean. Okay. I mean, one of the interesting things is everybody knows, although I am, well, I mean, I'm a Marxist in the sense that I think Marx had a lot of very sensible and interesting things to say about the nature of capitalism. But also in some respects, I'm a Weberian, right? Because I think Weber did as well. And people should remember that Weber wrote about charisma, particularly in relation to the rise of Islam, yeah? Which I think is an example exactly of the kind of thing you're talking about, right? The way that, in particular, the Eastern Roman Empire, which, remember, survived for a lot longer than the Western Empire, continued to be a stable and existing state, was completely transformed by the charismatic implications of the rise of Islam as a religion, which was in many respects a micro-emergent phenomenon. Yeah, exactly that kind of thing. It's a historical example. And one of the things I've decided to do, and Jill's allowed me to do it in the book we're rewriting, is to sort of do a bit of historical sociology as complexity. Yeah. So other things matter. There are all kinds of things like that. I'm very interested in the way that the cod fisheries and the herring fisheries enable populations, urban populations, to be fed in Europe in the late Middle Ages. And that was a very important basis of the development of the capitalist social order, just as important as the Protestant ethic. And it was about people doing something, going out and finding fishing grounds, yeah. And, that kind of thing matters. And I think it does matter, right? I think we will see changes that are occasioned in this kind of way, yeah. One of them is demography, yeah. There's nothing as concrete as people's decisions about how many children they're going to have. Now, that was imposed in China by the one-child policy. But I was very, very struck by my Chinese students, who are all, of course, single, only children, right? Saying, oh, yeah, we're only going to have one child. It's become a cultural norm, right? And probably the one-child policy in China is, in many ways barbaric as it was, has been one of the biggest active things which have reduced the possible implications of the nature and character of climate crisis. Yeah, and what kinds of decisions will we take globally? There are very few countries in the world, including quite a lot of Islamic countries like Iran, which have a total fertility rate replacement levels. Yeah, that's something which matters. Demography is extremely important as we have aging human populations, and I think that that's one of the things where the green movement has potential, right? Now, there's a lot of literature around what we should do, which emphasizes local community action development, and I completely agree with that, by the way, right? But also, I think it's very, very important to see what actions can be done by institutions and state structures, yeah? And I think it's very important to try and change that. And I paid a lot of attention to planning, to the extent why I'm enthusiastically encouraging my youngest child to take postgraduate courses as a planner, as a land use planner, because I think that that's going to be a very, very important kind of action, which will interact with pressures by local organizations around the implications of planning and development. Yeah. At the minute, real estate capital just gets whatever it wants. Yeah, and it's building houses or doing whatever it wants in these kinds of things. Real estate capital is the most important form of capital in the world today. So, you know, the confrontations over rent, which are happening in the United States at this point, where the Supreme Court has just struck down protections against eviction. That's the kind of thing which I think will have a lot of. So I agree with you, basically, Jean, as always.
Excellent, thank you. Yeah.
So lovely to see some harmony on a Friday. Gary, you have a question. Would you like to just come on and ask David?
Yeah, thanks, Anton. David, how's it? And thank you for joining us today. It's been great to listen to you. Just a quick question. You spoke of dialogues of difference or dialogue of difference. And it strikes me that we need to get humanity to do common things at times. So like with COVID, everyone to vaccinate. With climate change, everyone to turn away from oil and gas, but we're not doing that. We've kind of retreated into a sort of binary where we use power to then resolve the difference. Any thoughts from your side in terms of how we make dialogues of difference constructive, that allows us to do common action, or will that never happen?
You know, it's interesting that I'm in Scotland. Okay, because there's a big issue at the minute in Scotland about opening up another oil field off Shetland. Okay, and that, of course, from the point of view of fossil fuel use, is a disaster. But also, oil and its ancillary industries are pretty much the biggest part of industrial production that's left in Scotland. And in the northeast of Scotland, they're the source of enormous numbers of jobs. Nothing like the scale of coal, actually. I would have been in a really ambivalent position about coal because I fought like fury for most of my adult life to defend coal mines, right? Actively, I was very involved with the Durham Miners Association. But Maggie Thatcher did the job for us. I know that Boris was told off very badly for that, but by closing the UK coal industry, yeah, that we don't have that issue, right? But we have that issue. And these are real issues. These are, because like coal mining, the jobs around oil are actually well-paid working class jobs. Yeah. And you can see why there's an interest in preserving it, in dealing with it on those terms. Now, the Tory Prime Minister that I praised, Harold Macmillan, when he was running down the coal industry for economic reasons, right, rather than political reasons, tried very hard to develop alternative structures. Yeah. Alternative sources of employment. Scotland rants on about being so natural energy dependent, but it doesn't have any wind turbine manufacturing facilities, for example. Right? Yeah. So I think there has to be ways in which these conflicting interests can come to talk to each other, right? And some sort of mediation instead of standing and shouting at each other. Right? And it's difficult. It's not easy to do because that's exactly what's happening in Scotland at the minute, right? The people who want to get the oil from the west of Shetland and the people who are absolutely opposed to it are just standing shouting at each other. And that requires a government intervention to do something which is different. Now, the Scottish government under the SNP and Labour before it's been very poor on industrial policy, very poor in trying to develop alternatives and structures, despite the fact that much of the manufacturing capacity that's associated with oil could also be associated with alternative energy sources. Yeah. And I think it's the ability to try and present it in those terms. On a much bigger scale, when I look at the standard of living that I have, which is massively greater than my parents had 70 years ago. My parents reached a standard of living like that over a 30-year period, but so massively greater, I realized that there's a global conflict for, you know, people in India or South Africa to say, what the hell are you doing living at that standard of living, which is almost like a country squire of late 18th century England, right? Yeah. When we are having to face, you know, what we want to do is different, right? And I think that it's only when you get something, the reason why there's a move in China is because air pollution is so severe in Chinese cities. That's what's triggered the reaction of the Chinese Communist point. But also, by the way, I have lots of scientists and engineers in the higher cadre groups, which is actually a good thing, yeah, to start moving in those directions. But I completely agree. I don't think it's an easy thing to do. And it's difficult to find the mediating forces which can actually pick that up. And in the minute in Scotland, I tell you, we just don't have them.
Great. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, so I finally get to ask my questions. So you talked about the inequality that we're facing in contemporary society, and there certainly seems to be a great deal of echo with what we saw in the 1920s before the Great Wars we saw in the early 20th century, in terms of levels of inequality that existed then and levels of inequality that exists now. Besides these similarities, what other sort of key differences and similarities do you see between what's happened in the 20s and what's happening now? And should we be preparing for similar level kind of crises?
There's Eric Hobsbawm, who's a dreadful old Stalinist, but he was actually a very good historian, right? He wrote an essay in the 1970s called The Forward March of Labour Halted, right? Now, this is a very, class-oriented position. Class-oriented positions are not just positions for white Europeans and European descended. I mean, if you look at class politics, much of Latin America has been characterized by class politics over a long period of time. There's a reemergence of something like class politics in India, which I think is very important, right? And the great potential thing which the Chinese Communist Party is addressing inequality about is it's created a big industrial proletariat, right? It's also done things for that industrial proletariat, by the way, like introducing a social insurance system, very much on the lines of the social insurance system introduced in Bismarckian Germany at the end of the 19th century, yeah, for exactly the same reason, that it's an important mechanism for dealing with the kinds of discontent that emerge in industrial society. But what we saw was the emergence of social in Europe in particular, but also in some Australia and Canada had it as well, right? Australia very strongly so, and New Zealand very strongly so. The emergence of labor movements which organized politically and industrially to change things. Globalization has massively reduced the power of labor movements in key sectors, in high-income countries. But, you have to think about the high middle-income countries. They're so important. The conflict in Brazil is between the Workers' Party and a traditional corporatist military elite, which actually picked up on neoliberalism, as it did in Chile. Chile's another place. I've got somebody wanting to do a PhD with us in Durham, who's a Chilean, who's very, very interested in the changes that have occurred in Chile, which is a high middle-income country and actually verging on being a high-income country. But I think there are real issues in a lot of the rest of the world. I constantly used to teach urban studies, and I constantly tried to get students interested in the mega cities of sub-Saharan Africa, right? Places like Kinshasa or Nairobi, and trying to think about what inequality was like in relation to them and in relation to the lives that people have in those circumstances, yeah? And the interesting thing about that is they're not industrial cities, right? They have a lot of internal industrial production and ways of doing things, but they're not industrial cities. They're not really part of that globalized structure in the way that, say, Dhaka in Bangladesh is an industrial city with nearly 500,000 young women working in the ready-made clothing industry. So in an industrial world, you can see the possibility of the emergence of labor movements. And you do see it. You're seeing it in Bangladesh, for example. But I wonder what's happening in the rest of it. And I think those are just some sorts of problems that we have to think about and organize and confronting. There's clearly a reemergence. It never went away because there was always a labor movement tradition in India of organized labor. But then there's a lot of people in the world who aren't in organized jobs. South Africa, I think, 30-year workforce is in informal employment, right? I would recommend anybody interested in that have a look at some very interesting stuff. I only just came across this being done in Colombia, yeah, which also has a very high informal sector in relation to organization and change in those directions. But that was also associated with growth. It's like China, right? Inequalities increased in China, but everybody's so much better off that nobody's moaning about it. But that has been entirely on Deng Xiaoping's four modernizations and growth, growth, growth. And it's only very recently that the Chinese Communist Party have changed their line and said that maybe growth is not the be-all and end-all of everything. So it's tricky.
Mm. I was interested that you mentioned Ken Stanley Robertson. I recently read his book, Ministry for the Future, which I found...
Which I use a lot in this book, right? Yeah.
It's a very interesting take on where things go. But I mean, one of the issues that he grapples with in that book is this concept of national sovereignty and what that means in terms of dealing with truly global issues like climate change and even now with COVID and the vaccinations. What is your take on the future role of how we need to approach national sovereignty and its role in dealing with global problems?
I'll have to send to you the reference to this particular book. I'm terrible with names. I always have been, so I don't regard it as an implication of impending senility. But the guy who's the former professor of war studies, right? He's very strong on the notion that it's probably nation states that are going to have to deal with these issues, right? Provided they recognize that climate crisis is something on the scale of a war. So in the book, I actually argue for running our economies and societies pretty much in the way that the UK, which was the most central, it wasn't centralized, it was actually a lot of it was devolved to the regional level, but the most planned and coordinated economy that's probably ever existed in the world. Yeah. And the United States, to a considerable degree, worked in the same way. People think of the Soviet Union as the great planned economy, but in the context of the Second World War, the Western democracies ran highly planned economies, which created much greater equality, especially gender equality, actually. Yeah. My mother was a very considerable beneficiary of that, I have to say, although she did lose her high-level civil service job at the end of the Second World War when she got married. It was a marriage bar, which is why she had to become a primary teacher. But it's the recognition within national politics. But there's a real problem about that because political parties play to the very short term. They have a culture not of presenting alternatives, but of actually acting like market signal-based organizations. And I think, come on, terrible name. The guy, Colin Crouch. I don't know if people have read Colin Crouch's books. Colin Crouch is basically a political economist. He hid out in a business school at the last years of his career in Warwick, but he's written some very good books on this particular topic about the nature and character of politics in the contemporary era. And he talks about post-democracy in the high-income countries, where parties compete purely in terms of managerial efficiency, in terms of doing what's being done now, right? Sometimes things change. Brexit in the UK was a big kick up the backside for that kind of thing, and has led to a tremendous crisis inside the UK Labour Party. And actually a Conservative Party, which through COVID governed in a way which would be regarded as massively and dangerously left-wing in the Thatcher era. Yeah, but I really like the Ministry for the Future. I like particularly the fact that they have a dark ops section which engages in targeted political assassination, which I thought was rather a nice idea. But
rather entertaining. Well, before I ask more questions, let's see if there's anyone else. Andrea, do you have a question, comment?
Actually, yes. Sorry, I can't find the hand raising function. So just a kind of more sort of creative question, I suppose, or a discursive question. You talk about the Capitalocene, and you think that, or you said that you don't imagine a kind of a post-capitalist future. So if you were to give a kind of a term or a kind of a gripping metaphor to inspire us for the kind of future that you do imagine. Do you have a word for it yet, or is it something worth thinking about? Something to...
That's a really good, that's a lovely question, Andrea. I'll have to go away and think about it and encourage everybody else to do it as well. I mean, what I argue for is a confrontation with climate crisis based on collective engagement. Yeah, I mean, I'll spend a lot of time thinking about that. That's one to think about, but everybody else think about it as well and try and develop it. There was a big debate about market socialism on the left in the 1970s in the UK and elsewhere. Right, there was a big debate about it, and I actually was thrown out of Prague in 1968 by the Soviets. Okay, the Russians were very nice to me because I was a Brit, by the way. The Russians liked the Brits, right, but they still threw me out. And I think some of the things that were being developed in the Prague in the Dubček era, some of the economic ideas in particular, were extremely important, and that world historical event really was in many ways a tragedy. Right. Okay. I mean, I was only 21. I'd gone there to have a good time with some Czech friends of mine, but I was very, very sympathetic to what was happening in Prague. So I'll try and think of a phrase, but you're right. It's very much related to the things that Bruce said. Yeah, that we need this kind of language in order to drive what we're thinking about. Right? Because there's no doubt. Remember, Marx was enormously sympathetic to capitalism. Right. He saw it as an enormously progressive force. And in many respects, he was right. I'm not a peasant. You know, I do grow potatoes as a hobby. But if my potato crop is crap, I don't starve to death. And that happened to my great-great-grandparents. Yeah, that's what capitalism gave us.
Okay, thank you. I'm looking forward to your new book with that.
I'm looking forward to you doing it as well. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? I think we have time for one more. Okay, maybe I'll throw one last one out then, David. Given that capital is globally mobile, you know, a corporation that operates in America can, in the face of growing trends in sort of demands for equal pay or better pay for middle-class workers, shift production facilities to another country where those demands don't exist. Do you think that that sort of necessitates something like a global taxation framework to kind of balance that out?
Look, you know, it's interesting. The OECD is arguing for that, right? The OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, one of the high priests of neoliberalism, things like country by country accounting. Yeah, so that corporations cannot use transfers between countries to minimize their tax payments in particular countries, as Amazon does in the UK by locating in Luxembourg, right? I would actually use the parachute regiment to take out Luxembourg and Monaco, right? You know, that they're nests of pirates, right? As is the city of London, okay? But the idea of country by country accounting, the idea of standardizations of corporation tax, there is a reaction against the corporation tax race to the bottom. Yeah, that kind of thing I think is very, very important. I think we just have to accept some, I mean, you know, coal mining disappeared politically, but what disappeared in the northeast of England at the same time was an enormous clothing industry, right? Which closed down because Marks and Spencer shifted its business model and started getting goods from Bangladesh instead. And you can't criticize the implications of that for Bangladesh, because a PhD student I had working on TB in Bangladesh from a complexity frame of reference said that many of these young women are supporting entire families at a better level in the villages on the wages that they get as a Bangladeshi ready-made clothing worker. I love that expression because in Bangladesh, people had their clothes made in the village by the tailor. Yeah. So it's globalization is there, but there has to be national interventions and control over capital flows, which were normal in the period up until the early 1980s. Yeah, there has to be some direction, not to stop capital working. And much of this capital now in India and China is self-developed capital. right? And even in Bangladesh. South Africa lost its clothing industry, I think, to these same countries at the same time. I remember being told that in Durham. But actually developing the structures which deal with the issues we have now. And their health is enormously important. Health in the United States is seen as a capitalist activity with enormous profit returns, right? That's why it's so expensive. It's 18% of GDP expenditure in the USA is on health. So developing the kinds of universal basic services as a charge on capital. In other words, politics takes charge of capital instead of capital having charge of politics, right? That's the physiology. Yeah.
Excellent. This has been enormously interesting. I've really enjoyed this.
Well,
I know we're up. I know we're up on time. It's noon now, so it's usually, unfortunately, the time where we have to say goodbye. But maybe we'll have you back one day, David, if you're willing.
it's been a real pleasure. Thank you, folks.
Thank you. It has been wonderful.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm trying to make my video bigger so that I can, yeah, okay. But Anton, thanks. And David, it was wonderful to chat to you. I'm very much looking forward to reading your new book.
Can't afford it. I will happily send you a PDF.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. We'll play African kind of, yeah. Okay, great. And so next week we'll be shifting on to something less macro and slightly creative, which will be an interesting new angle. I'm trusting Glenn Holtzman, our speaker for next week, to bring us into something very different. So we'll be talking about complexity and music and creativity, and yeah, it will be, I think, interesting take on complexity too. But David, thank you so much. I hate these goodbyes. It's very difficult to press that end button.
I'm doing it now because I'm going for a cycle ride. Bye.
Oh, awesome. Thank you for that. All right. Cheers, everyone. Okay, bye.